It's good to play very tight when you first sit down at the table. Your opponents won't be paying quite as much attention as you, so over time you will be in a better position to make decisions than they are. Poker is a war for information. Right now, under the fog of war, you are both guessing about each other's playstyles, and thus it is better to take a cautious approach and fold more. A skilled gambler doesn't want to wager in EV-neutral situations since this incurs unnecessary variance. One argument for 3-betting here is my short stack. My opponent's positional advantage will be nullified somewhat by my 32 big blind stack. 3-betting preflop with a strong hand is basically leveraging your moderate advantage preflop and on the majority of flops versus your opponent's infrequent large advantage when they hit hard. Often you will win small pots and sometimes you will lose big ones. When you are short stacked, your opponent's payoff is lessened the times they do hit. Folding is not obviously the best play here. It is very possible that you could show a profit by 3-betting or even calling. That being said, I do think the decision is close, and any long-term profit from playing this hand would be minimal. Double-suited queens or single-suited kings should be re-raised in this situation with the plan of stacking off on any flop. You'll note I have labeled certain players yellow or orange. Yellow indicates a recreational player, often with a VPIP around 40 to 60, while orange means tight and aggressive. These labels are critical for future game selection. I use green for players with VPIPs north of 60 and red for loose aggressive regulars. Had we been check raised on the flop, the best play here would be to fold. While hitting this board certainly seems implausible, either of our opponents deciding to check raise bluff is even more unlikely. What little statistical information we do have on the small blind indicates that he could possibly play hands with a dangling deuce. It is a costly mistake to assume without evidence that your opponents are always bluffing. Given the lockdown nature of this board, this minuscule sizing is adequate, but perhaps 15 or 20 cents would have gotten more value from overpairs of 3-5. The turn fold is far from clear. Both trips are real possibilities for our loose opponent, but we only need to have the best hand around half the time to make a shove profitable. Did he turn gin, or did he pick up a flush draw with his gut shot or overpair? Our flop bet may have drawn a call from 4xxx. With limited information on our opponent, we are forced to guess blindly. In the next scenario, getting 3-1 and being against players who seem likely to make post-flop mistakes, it is tempting to call pre-flop with this decent hand. We have a suited ace and moderate connectivity, and it's good from a long-term strategic perspective to be able to hit some middle flops. While our absolute position after the flop will be very poor, we have good relative position to try and check raise the pre-flop raiser. Despite these strengths, you do want to minimize the number of hands you play from the blinds, and this hand really only has 3 cards working together. Change the ace to a 10, or make the open a min raise, and you would have a profitable call. Despite the dangling 7, this hand with moderate high card strength and a suited ace is sufficient for opening on the button. This dry board is excellent to continue betting on, both because ace-queen is best a lot of the time, and because my opponent could easily fold ace-king or a pocket pair. There's a roughly 80% chance the big blind doesn't have an 8, and this bet only has to work 1 time in 3 to be profitable. That being said, checking back the flop doesn't necessarily concede the pot, and even has the potential for decent profit if I turn a pair and I induce a bluff. All in all, betting the flop is best, and on these types of board textures, you don't have to bet much relative to the size of the pot. On the left table, with a strong hand, the opportunity to put in most of our stack, and a 3-way pot, we have a clear 3-bet. Our short stack negates our post-flop positional disadvantage, and we should have an equity edge over our opponent's presumably weaker hands. On the right table, this is sort of a bottom-of-the-barrel cutoff open. Our low pair is a liability, but we have decent connectivity and a suit. You don't need a powerhouse to open from the cutoff. With a loose player on the button, you want to open a little more selectively. But with a loose player in the small blind, you want to open a little more aggressively, so it's a wash. Three-way, I decide simply to give up after the flop. You don't have to try to win every pawn. On the left table, I make a tight fold with ace-queen, jack-3 double suited. I'm concerned about my weak absolute position, my dangler, and the relative tightness of my opponents. You should in general be cautious about jumping to wild conclusions on the basis of limited statistical data, but there is enough information here to argue in favor of a cautious approach. On the right table, we have an example of a fine hijack open. A lot of people look at the tempting odds offered with small blind completion and make the mistake of calling too frequently after a limper or two. Your positional disadvantage usually presents too many opportunities for mistakes to allow for loose calls from the small blind over limpers. On the right, we have an example of the sort of hand which can complete. There is no profit in drawing to this flush on a paired board. Even if the board wasn't paired, the call would be dubious. On the left, I chose not to open from the hijack because of my dangling 8, although the ace-king-queen super try certainly tempts one to raise. This is a top-of-the-line fold. If my hand were any stronger, say double suited, or if the 8 were a 9, or I were in a later position, then I would have a clearly profitable open. While there are some metagame benefits to opening wide, break-even-ish hands like this one can be either played or folded at will. Both the button and the cutoff seem like loose players, which argues in general for tighter play, but this hand does benefit from a short stack. On the right, in great position with a fairly strong hand, we have more than enough to open raise from the cutoff. The flop is a poor semi-bluffing opportunity with such a weak draw against two loose players. The button has already demonstrated fairly passive play up to this point, so we have a reasonable expectation of seeing a turn for free. On the turn, with the nuts, we have an obvious raise. But what should our approach be on the river if we are called and the board texture changes? Here again we benefit from a short stack, in that our opponent will not be able to make a large pot-sized bluff or value bet, thus making it more difficult for him to profitably draw against us. Since we will have already committed more than half our stack, we should probably not fold to any river action, no matter which card falls, and should likely value bet liberally if he checks, even if the board texture changes. On the left, it'll be difficult to make any money out of position against a tight raiser with these weak queens. King 9-2 would be a more interesting situation, and I suspect there we would have a profitable 3-bet. You definitely do not want to be calling a lot of raises out of position in pot limit Omaha. Again on the left, we are in position with a hand which is fairly coordinated. We also want to play pots with Zed Tarman. Unfortunately, there are 3 players behind us who could 3-bet, and we're not really deep enough to exploit the 2 players who are acting before us. All in all, this is a fairly marginal situation, and the call would probably be slightly unprofitable. Ace-Jack 5-5 double suited is not an incredibly strong hand, but we'd love to play a pot in position against the loose passive player in the big blind, and you don't need a monster to open from the cutoff. With such a gin flop, we'd be happy to stack off here. But what should our approach be for various turns if we are called on the flop? We could simply bet every turn, or we could check back full houses and or flushes in the hopes of eliciting river bluffs or calls, and also minimizing our losses when we do happen to lose to a higher flush. The check back the flush approach might be more viable on a board where there are more straight draws, like Ace 8-7, especially if you think your opponent is unlikely to take a passive line with a made hand. Jack 10 8-7 double suited is a great hand to isolate a loose limper with, especially on the button. On the flop, with no equity against a fairly loose opponent, I decide to simply give up. In general, you want to value bet loose players relentlessly and only bluff them rarely. The essence of winning poker is to bet strong hands and fold weak hands. Far too many players succumb to fancy play syndrome instead of focusing on the fundamentals. In a lively full ring game, you might limp a hand like this from early position, with the hopes of trapping the field with a limp re-raise. But shorthanded, and the cutoff I have to open. These super premium aces can also be re-raised in virtually any position, to any action, with any stack size, since they have tremendous post-flop playability in addition to their all-in equity. This is a great flop for my hand, with my overpair, nut flush draw, double set draw, and blockers to the straight draw, and I wouldn't hesitate to stack off if I'm raised. The turn, however, presents an interesting situation. Most likely, if my opponent had two pair or a set, he would have raised the flop, and a lot of combinations of flush draws would do so as well. If my opponent had something like a pair and open-ended, or a weak wrap, then I benefit from checking the turn. Even if my opponent has a pair up draw, he may very well bet the turn for me anyway. Nonetheless, you can't go wrong with betting the nuts, and I do want to build a pot with this very likely winner. In general, passive play should be avoided.